guys in Arizona. Hope you're having a super fantastic sparkling day. Welcome to Before the Dirt Nap podcast number 1981. Get to cross that one off. Threads of Joy, uplifting stories from family history. I thought, what a great positive way to start the new year. We had our New Year celebration yesterday. We're getting all sparkly today. And I thought, maybe it's time to, we'll get the year kicked off on the right note. Let's look at some of those uplifting stories that are within your family tree. There are some great stories out there. There are stories of courage. There are stories of kindness. There are stories of heroism. There are stories of struggle. There are stories of overcoming. There's a ton. Any story that you can think of, it has happened in your family tree, whether you want to believe it or not. There are stories in your tree that'll make you go, wow. There are stories in your tree that'll go, so that's where that comes from, huh? No wonder I do that all the time. It's in my nature. It's in your genes. Yeah, and we're talking the DNA genes, not the denim genes. So let's have a look at some of the different things that we can have a look at and some of the stories that you can go looking for. There's been a lot of stuff that happens out there in the world. There's been, different wars fought on different places. There's been persecution that's happened. There's been natural disasters. There's been fires. There's been all sorts of stuff that has come up that has provided a challenge for our ancestors. Even with us today, there's stuff that's coming up that's providing us with challenges. But if you look back in your ancestry, you will find these incredible stories, and that you may not even have to go. You may not even have. Excuse me. You may not even have to go that far back to find some of these stories. So think of some of the challenges your ancestors. If you've got anyone that rode that was on the wagon trails, what challenges did they have to overcome? There was a lot of walking in those days. There were Indian attacks. There were broken wagon wheels. All sorts of challenges that they came up with. People died on the trail. People were born on the trail. There was a whole bunch of stuff, and they had And if you have actually seen one of those wagons, they are not that big. I was at where was I? I was at one of those museums that's for cars and things like that. But it was a transportation museum, because they went back and they actually had a wagon that had been used in one of those cross-country treks. And I looked at that thing and went, that is tiny. And I'm like thinking, you've got these people that are sleeping in it. They're sleeping. No wonder they couldn't sleep in it, because it was so short, but they would sleep under it. And just to get the shelter and that sort of things. Or they'd put the children in the wagon and the parents would sleep underneath the wagon. There's all sorts of different things. And I'm just like thinking, oh my gosh, those things are so tiny. And they were literally taking every possession that they had with them in that wagon as they were trekking off from east to west to go set up and start a new life. You've got ancestors in your history that may have been the founders of a community or a county within a different state. I have a client, and in her tree, we have the challenges that we have is that her family's land was grabbed back by the government, and so they had to find new land to go and live on. And so they went on this trek. And it was her third great grandfather and fourth great grandfather and fourth great grandfather, father and son, that went off on this trek to find a new place for them to live. They found a place, they settled it. They actually ended up settling, being one of the first settlers in a county. Then they were there for a year, getting everything all set up and organized and ready for the family. Then they went back and got the family and moved through, I think it was 2 different states to get to the one where they had to go through 2 different states to get to the one where they had set up. What an incredible story. What an incredible story of challenges. Our government seized back the land. We got to go find a new place to live. Meanwhile, the family's getting evicted over here because the land's being grabbed back by the government, and we've got to go find somewhere to live for our family before we can bring them all up there. Because what if they got up there and there's no land available to where they thought they could go? And so they had to go and hunt out this land. You didn't really want to go tracking, the wife and the kids along with you on those ones. So the husbands have been gone for a year before they came back to pick them all up and then move them. And now you're having to uproot, you've been in temporary accommodations. Now you've got to uproot everything and move. Do we have those challenges today? Absolutely. But think about this back in that time. They didn't have computers. They had nothing electronic. They had no cars. It was walking most of the time. They probably had wagons that they put everything in. They may have had times that they could have ridden in the wagon, or they may have had to like lead the horses in the wagon, depending what they were going up and down as well, because there may have been some hills or mountains they had to get over in these wagons. And so to make it less taxing on the horses, everybody was off and walking. And so the horses only had to pull up the wagons. But then what if the wheel hit a rock and it split the wheel? Now you've got a three-wheeled wagon with these horses wanting to pull it, or your horse is so tight, your horse literally runs itself to death and falls over dead. So now you're minus a horse trying to get the stuff up a hill. So you never know what stories or challenges that they had overcome. There's stories of people being kidnapped, and it could have been for anything: kidnapped into slavery, kidnapped into trafficking, horrendous things that they had to go through. This same family in the same family tree, the fourth great grandmother, yes, was kidnapped. No, hang on, the fifth great grandmother was kidnapped. And by Indians and taken up into the French part of Canada there in Quebec, and was sold as slaves up there in Quebec. And it was 20 years before she finally got home. Her husband was away fighting at a war at the time when she was kidnapped. He comes home to find his children have no mother because the mother's been kidnapped. He spends the next 20 years hunting for her, following up on clues. He finally gets this clue to where she is, and so he goes off to find her. Meanwhile, when he found out where she was and starts his trek for that, she's been a French doctor, purchased these slaves and set them free. And so she then made her way down from Canada back down to Virginia, which is where they were living at the time. She gets home, and her 1-year-old baby at the time is now a young man standing there opening the door. When she explains who she is and what's happened, he says that his father left a few days beforehand to go and find her because he now knew where she was, so he was going to go and rescue her. So she gets on horseback and goes off after him, and she comes across this little settlement. They don't know where the settlement was in Virginia. All they know is it's somewhere in Virginia as she's heading north. And she comes across this group of people up on a knoll. So she goes up to them to find out if they had seen her husband. They were actually holding a funeral service for her husband. She had been away from him for 20 years. She was trying to get back home. He was trying to find her for 20 years. And when she finally catches up with him, he passed away the day before she found him. I mean, talk about hard stories and resilience. And, you just got to keep moving forward. All of these stories build their character, and they help form traits that actually get passed down through generations. So there's probably some challenges that your ancestors have been through that they've passed down through generations, and you're going, well, I wonder where that came from. And as you start unraveling your family history, these stories start popping up. My dad's side of the family, they've got a huge military service on that side of the family, huge military service. My great-grandfather fought in World War I and then was a captain of Fort Balance, which overlooked the entry into Wellington Harbour in World War II. He ended up having a business where he was a gunsmith and a locksmith. Good combination to put together. That's in my only family tree. I had my second great-grandmother had to raise her she actually had 2 children, and she was pregnant with a third when her husband went missing on a barge in the river. And he went in May, and they didn't find him till August. And meanwhile, she's got 2 young children. She's pregnant with a third. And the third one ended up being a son, and she ends up putting him up for adoption because she couldn't deal with 2 young children. And she's just got story after story of hardships and all of that. I've got another second great grandmother who was, and I will tell you this, all my second great grandmothers were involved in the suffragette movement in New Zealand, which got the women the vote in 1893. And I've actually seen documents that where the petitions were signed, and I can actually find my second great grandmothers for those that were in New Zealand at the time, on these petitions. And one of my second great grandmothers, hers is you've got the lines going down here on the page, and her signature is right here at the bottom, on the bottom of that page. It's just right there at the bottom. But yeah, I've seen digital copies, digital images of that document that was signed, and she was part of the suffragette movement when New Zealand gave women the right to vote in 1893, which was a pretty big, significant thing. And these women, oh my gosh, they all of them, I think, if I remember correctly, all my second great grandmothers were all born in England and came out to New Zealand. Just think of that. You're in a boat, in a ship, and those ships were not big. Nothing like the cruise ships we have today. These were just small ships. They actually had a replica of the Endeavour, which was Captain James Cook's ship. And if you're in New Zealand and you find a 50-cent piece, have a look on the back, and there's a picture of the Endeavour on there. They brought in a half-size replica of the Endeavour. And I looked at that and I thought, that's only half size. I'm like, jeepers. This thing looked tiny. And I'm thinking, and that's only half size, so I've got to double that to get the full size. It was a small ship that these guys went exploring on. You may have explorers in your ancestry. There's all these famous explorers that explored different new lands or discovered new lands when they went sailing out, and then they went trekking over these lands. Do you have any of those in your family history? And what stories and what journals? Most of those guys had journals that they kept. Have you seen any of these journals of your ancestors? So that's just that story of resilience, of challenges, of discovery, perseverance, just helping them. And you learn about their resilience and their can-do attitude. Christopher Columbus was insistent that the world was round. Everybody else was talking about it being flat. So he sent out sailing on the Santa Maria with the two other ships behind him. I can't remember their names. I know that they both begin with N. Nina was one of them. Can't remember the other one. To prove that the world was round. And that's how he discovered America, because he was following this curve. Everybody else thought the world was flat. How cool is that, to be able to read some of his journals and things? There's been traits that are being passed down through families as well. Some have got this can-do attitude. A lot of New Zealanders, when the Europeans came down and settled in New Zealand, there was a lot of stuff that they didn't have down there, so they had to build it. There's a lot of inventions that came out of New Zealand that people didn't realize are actually New Zealand inventions, and there's stuff that you use every day. And I don't have my list in front of me. My book is on the bookcase behind the curtain, which has what some of the New Zealand inventions were over the years. And the Hamilton jet is a jet engine that will run literally take you on a jet ride in 4 inches of water. And you can get to do some of these when you go down to New Zealand. There's a lot of jet boating, different activities and stuff you can do where they will curve up close to the banks and away again, and they're running through inches of water, not feet of water, inches. It may come up to your knees, it may come up onto your ankles, but they're putting these jets through there, and that was a New Zealand invention. It was using the water as a propulsion for that. And I had my great uncle and one or two of his sons would build these engines and race them. And we were actually going through Southwoods Museum in New Zealand when I was last down there in 2019. And I was looking at, what was it called? Can't remember what the jet boat was called. This beautiful big jet boat, absolutely gorgeous. And I was reading about some of Len Southwood is the guy who had this big collection of cars that's on display, and they only have a small percentage of his entire collection on display at any one time. But people didn't realize that he was into jet boat racing. And my dad stood there and told me that my great uncle and Len Southwood would not flip the boats, but flip who won the races. They would race against each other often, and depending on the day, one would win and the other one wouldn't. And they'd come in a close second and then have a race the next day, and it would flip it around. The other person would win. And he said they were literally going backwards and forwards on first place when they were racing their boats. So that was something that I learned about my great uncle, which was really cool. I thought, well, this is, I've got a tie to the Southwoods Museum because my great uncle used to race against that boat that they have on display there. So I thought that was really cool. But there's all sorts of things out there. What about kindness or generosity that made differences in your community, in their communities or the families? Look for those sorts of stories as well, You've got those that help with the undergrounds, and there's undergrounds all over the world in all different situations for all different sorts of reasons, but they had these underground movements that would help move people from one place to another. Oh, she's chomping on a yak stick. It's a yak cheese stick, which doesn't have lactose in it, and so she loves those things. I will tell you a funny story real quick. She got confused the other day because she was walking along with her yak stick, and this thing was like about this long, and it's sticking out of her mouth, and she drops it, and it broke into two. And she's just standing there, and she's just like looking at it. Well, like Zeffie had no clue what to do with her yak stick that had broken into two pieces when it hit the tile. It was just the way it hit, the angle it had, it just split it into two. But anyway, back to what are we back to? Oh yeah, the underground movements. So there's been underground movements all throughout history for various reasons, from religious persecution to freeing slaves to rescuing during the wars, and that rescuing the Allies and getting them out of the country, smuggling them out of the country so they can come back and fight again. There's been underground movements that have helped the Allies during the war with blowing things up or disabling things. And there's stories after story after story of different underground movements for different reasons. So have a look through your family history. Were they involved in any of those movements? And there's a lot of different types of undergrounds that were out there. But they were all part of, these people were acting out of the kindness of their hearts to help these people or help this campaign occur. There was underground movements used for the D-Day landings on June 6th in 1914. No, later, 1942. Sorry, I was thinking Gallipoli in that moment. But yeah, there were people that would just out of the kindness of their hearts that would take strangers into their houses. Like if you read the story, Anne Frank's diaries is a great example of that, where her family and another family were hidden in this person's house during World War II. They eventually got found, yes, but the person out of the kindness of their heart took this family in and hid them and fed them and looked after them and everything else. And we wouldn't have the stories about this today because if they had not done that. If Anne Frank and her family had been taken, she would have just been a number, literally been a number. But this way, because she kept a diary, we were able to find out what life was like in hiding up until the time that she was, till she was found. Just look through history. There are so many really cool stories out there. You want romance stories? Look in your family tree. What's some of the romance stories that happened here? Was there an arranged marriage in there? Was it out of love? What was the courtship like? Just remembering a funny story that my mother-in-law told me one time about her courtship with her husband, about how he literally stalked her. So there's that sort of thing that goes on as well. Yes, back in the day, it was okay to get on a bus and follow a girl home to see where she lived and just try and get her to go out with you. And I actually learned something different, because when they said, oh, I'm washing my hair that night, it actually was a thing where a girl would pick one night a week, and it may be sisters that got together and did this, but this woman would pick one night a week where she would wash and set her hair, and that would last her for the week. And so the hair was only getting washed once a week, and then she'd have this one night of the week where her hair was washed and set. And I was like, okay. And we're talking the curlers and all sorts of things going on there with the hair, and how it got this really good wash. And then they set it in curlers, and had to sleep with a little net over it, little hair net over it. And it brings me back images of Ina Sharples. And those who know Coronation, the TV series Coronation Street, will know exactly who I'm talking about. Her and, what was the other woman's name? There was Ina Sharples that would wear the hairnet, and then there was the other character that would have the scarf tied up. Would have the scarf over her head and should have it tied up here. And she would have her hair and curlers too. But anyway, so there's all these sorts of different stories that you can find out about through journals, through newspaper articles, through journals, newspaper articles, even community books that have been written about the settling of different eras, books that have been written about the different historical events that have happened over time. Your ancestors may be mentioned in those books. You'll find all sorts of stories. You'll even find some really funny, quirky stories as well. Like if your family has a saying, does your family have a saying that's been passed down through generations? What skills and talents or achievements of your ancestors? Celebrate the creativity and the artistry or ingenuity within your family. Did they invent something? Were they an entertainer of some sort, being being on stage in drama or singing, or maybe they played a musical instrument and were very good at it? We had one of Brad's, oh, was he an uncle or a great uncle? Used to play pianos on cruise ships. We found a lot of entries of his name on the Ellis Island, because the cruise ships would come and drop him off at Ellis Island, and they would have to go through the process to get it back into the States. And he was in there a lot, and his job was to play the piano on a cruise ship. And this is back in the early 1900s. And so, was there somebody who was an artist in the family who did some drawings or paintings or everything else? Brad's great grandfather was a very, very good artist. He was never formally trained in art. He just picked up a paintbrush and a canvas one day and just started painting. And I remember going to when I was my mother-in-law's house, there'd be just all these paintings all over the place that he had painted over time. And so there was that sort of thing. A very good friend of my late mother-in-law, her parents would carve these beautiful brooches of birds out of bits of wood when they were in the Japanese camps during World War II, when they were put into these camps. Because they were Japanese, they were put into these camps that they had to stay in. But my mother-in-law would take them down wood that they could use for these carvings, and the husband would carve the birds, and the wife would do all the intricate little paintings and everything. They're called the Takahashi birds. So if you go Google Takahashi birds, and you'll see these gorgeous pin brooches that were made out of wood. And my mother-in-law supplied them with a lot of wood to help them do their carvings and everything else. And like I said, the wife did all the painting and everything on that. So look for things like that. Look for another act of kindness. My grandmother was a seamstress, and she would volunteer at one of the thrift stores in town. In fact, I was looking up for something else on the map in the city that she used to live in, and I came across this thing, and I'm like, well, that looks familiar. And I will tell you, that thrift store is still in business today. I used to go visit that thrift store when I used to stay with my grandmother. If it was her turn on the thrift store, we would go over there, and us kids would play around in the store and things like that. We would help sell stuff while she sat there and did mending. All the clothes that were donated, she would take them home, go through them, wash them all, iron them, check for anything that needed to be mended. Was it missing buttons? Did it need a zipper replaced? And she would sit there and do all of that stuff, and then take it all back to the shop, and it would get priced and put on the racks and all of that sort of thing. So I remember those sorts of things. So there's just, and the other thing is, be grateful for the people who have come before you, the sacrifices that they made, the achievements that they've done the achievements that they have done, that they have accomplished in their lifetime that you may not know about. And when you go and exploring these different ancestors and everything else, and even don't forget the offshoots, don't forget the aunts and the uncles and the cousins, because they can help you find more people. They can help you find more information for moving up the direct line. They also have stories too. They have a lot of stories. So, have fun with it. Find the fun things. Find the joy in your tree. I'm going through at the moment, doing some corrections on my tree, and I'm coming across this one, and I'm like, oh, isn't this the one? And so I go look at my notes to see, did I have that story there? And a lot of times I'll have the story like in the notes or in the comments that is against that person. And sometime I will go back and I will copy that information, put it in a document, and upload it for everybody else to read. But for now, no. Do you have any writers in your family? Do you have storytellers in your family? I have storytellers in my family. I came across my great aunt the other day, and all I could think of was her and her sister sitting there, both telling their stories at the same time. Like they're literally sitting next to each other. They're sitting next to each other, or they're sitting across the table from each other, and they're both telling their own story and responding to the other person's, commenting on the other person's story at the same time. It was exhausting to watch, but it was so much fun. Could I follow it? Absolutely not. But it was fun just to listen to them. And I just sat there in awe as these two women were talking. I'm like, how are they following the other person's conversation while telling their story at the same time and commenting on the other person's story? It was just a feat I would never think of. But my grandfather had an incredible imagination. And he used to tell us kids when we were small, he'd sit us on his lap or on the sofa next to him, depending how many grandkids he had there at the time that would tell the stories. And he would start telling us fairy tales, just common fairy tales, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, Cinderella, Pinocchio, just all these different stories he would start telling us. But they never, ever ended the same way twice. They never ended how they end in the fairy tales that we know them how to end, go off and live happily ever after. No, there is no happily ever after in these things. Well, there is kind of, he just expands the story. You may end up, like when Goldilocks ran out of the house, she may have ended up going through some cave into some fairyland and playing with the fairies and the swans and all this. It was just absolutely amazing stories. Where did Snow White end up? There was a Snow White one. Where did she end up? Oh, it would end up with her and the handsome prince and the dwarfs. What did they end up doing? Oh, I can't remember now. It's been a lot of years. But I know that there was a story of the 7 dwarves and the handsome prince and Snow White. And after he woke her up, they went off somewhere and the dwarves went with them. And they all ended up living together in some palace somewhere. And the dwarves didn't have to do any more mining or anything else. They found other talents, other ways to use their talents. I tell you, he had a phenomenal imagination for telling stories and just taking a regular fairy tale and turning it into something completely different. It would start off the same way, but I would sort of be like thinking that I can always remember sitting there and going, yeah, I know this bit of the story. Come on, get to the end. I was always wanting him to get to the end of the fairy tale where he would then add on his piece because I'd love to see where he would go. But it was just his imagination. And we got told Goldilocks and the Three Bears story. I think I know of at least 5 different endings he gave us. And there'll be times, can you tell us the Goldilocks and Three Bears story? And can we have it end this way? And so he'd start on that ending, but he would change it. It wouldn't end the same way he told it last time. But phenomenal storyteller. So, you have people that have talents in there. You've got people in there who could play any musical instrument that was put into their hands. Give them a couple of minutes and they got it. So find those people in your tree, celebrate them, be grateful for them. There may be things that they, look for those that went through the struggles and persevered and kept moving forward, just something inside of them just kept driving them forward. There was something in their family that had a sense of duty to country or a sense of duty to family. There are some that had they were curious, very, very curious, and so they became like the explorers and the moving around people. There were those that wanted to help others in any way that they could. Some of them got paid for it, some of them did not. And those that didn't get paid for it, they did it from the kindness of their hearts. So go out and celebrate those stories. Find those stories in your tree and just share them with the rest of your family. Ask your family members about any stories that they know of their ancestors they may have been told about. Especially talk to the older generation that you have, because they have some really cool stories. And then once they tell you the stories and you've recorded the session, go back, transcribe the session, and then go look up the facts of the story to see how real is that story. Is there a magazine? Is there an article written about it? Is there something written about it somewhere? Or is it recorded somewhere? It may not be in their journals. It could be in somebody else's journal. And you can use other people's stories to fill in the blanks in your story. And we got taught that a couple of years ago at the week-long genealogy class that I do at the end of July. And I remember that. And this guy, they were following his ancestor across in a wagon train. And at some point he dropped off the wagon train, but they didn't know why. And so they started researching and they came across a newspaper. They came across somebody's journal that mentioned it. So then they went and looked at the newspaper articles and found the newspaper articles as to why this particular ancestor of his was left behind, and how he ended up living in Ohio instead of going all the way across. I think he was going to Oregon, but he got left behind in Ohio. And because they'd been looking for this guy, because they knew that he had been on this wagon train that was going to end in Oregon, but there's no record of him in Oregon at that time when the wagon train arrived. And so then they had to backtrack to find out where had he dropped off the train? Why did he drop off the wagon train? And they found him in this place in Ohio. And he found it first in somebody's journal entry, and then he went and looked up in the newspapers and found the article there that explained why he was being left behind in that area. So there's stories out there. Go find the stories. Please do yourself, make that a goal for 2025, to find out these really cool stories about your ancestors. What is something unusual that they did? What is a talent that they had? What is something that they accomplished? Did they escape from somewhere? Did they man the underground and help people escape? Did they help the Allies during the war with all the underground movements and everything else? There's so many different stories out there. What was the courtship like for your ancestors? Are there any cool stories about courtship? Did they have any particular talent, whether it be in music and writing, in the arts, in some way? What talent did they have? Did they found any? Were they the founders of a business? Were they the founders? Were they the pioneers in a county? There are so many stories out there, and if you come across a name that looks familiar to you and that might be related to your family tree, go research it. You never know where the connections are going to come from. There's names that I've come across, and I've come across that name somewhere before, and I go and look at my tree and it's not there. And I'm like, I know I've seen that name somewhere before. So I'll actually look through all the other trees, like my clients' trees and everything else. And sometimes I've found connections that the connection was in somebody's family tree. And the reason it triggered was because I had worked on that name for a client. And so I went back and found this really cool story for it. So I sent that. So I would then research it, and then I would send that story off to my client to say, hey, stumbled across this, recognized the name, went and researched it, and guess what? Your third great uncle, guess what he did? This is what he did. Here's a newspaper article about him. So, you find newspapers are a great resource. So anyway, with that, we're out of here. Show gratitude towards your ancestors for what they have overcome, what they have accomplished, what they have persevered, and for what they have passed down through generations, from the lessons that they learned from their challenges that they've faced in life. What did they pass down through the generations about moving forward? Keep moving forward. Why, how, all of that sort of stuff. Go out. And let us know in the comments. My question for you today is, what is one story or tradition from your family history that always makes you smile or feel inspired? And with that, we are out of here. Go out, have a super fantastic, sparkling evening, and we'll catch you guys back here tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. Pacific.